Welcome back to Timeless Testimonies, everyone. We're going to pick up with the remainder of what we were going through in our last video. Because it's a little lengthy, I'm not going to review this portion, but I would like to suggest that you watch the previous video, Doubting the Testimonies Part 1, so that you can have the context, because we're going to just get right back into it. So here's where it picks up. A testimony for certain young men, first published in 1880, speaks of this point as follows, quoting, "A prevailing skepticism is continually increasing in reference to the testimonies of the Spirit of God, and these youth encourage questionings and doubts instead of removing them, because they are ignorant of the spirit and power and force of the testimonies." That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 437. "I was shown that many had so little spirituality that they did not understand the value of the testimonies or their real object. They talked flippantly of the testimonies given by God for the benefit of His people, and passed judgment upon them, giving their opinion and criticizing this and that, when they would better have placed their hands upon their lips and prostrated themselves in the dust, for they could not appreciate the spirit of the testimonies, because they knew so little of the Spirit of God." That was a paraphrase of a section from the Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 443. So again, the context is doubting the testimonies. And what we find here is that many who are doubting the testimonies are doing so simply because they don't understand the Spirit of God. They are ignorant of it. They're ignorant of the power and the force of the testimonies. So if that's the case, then it would be really good for us to become very, very acquainted with who the Spirit is and what the Spirit of the testimonies is all about. "There are some in Battle Creek who have never fully submitted to reproof. They have taken a course of their own choosing. They have ever, to a greater or less degree, exerted an influence against those who have stood up to defend the right and reprove the wrong. The influence of these persons upon individuals who come here and who are brought in contact with them is very bad. They fill the minds of these newcomers with questionings and doubts in regard to the testimonies of the Spirit of God. They put false constructions upon the testimonies, and instead of leading persons to become consecrated to God and to listen to the voice of the church, they teach them to be independent and not to mind the opinions and judgments of others. The influence of this class has been secretly at work. Some are unconscious of the harm they are doing, but unconsecrated, proud, and rebellious themselves, they lead others in the wrong track. A poisonous atmosphere is inhaled from these unconsecrated ones. The blood of souls is in the garments of such, and Christ will say to them in the day of final settlement, 'Depart from me, all ye workers of iniquity.' Astonished they will be, but their professedly Christian lives were a deception, a fraud." That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, pages 513 and 514. Now, notice one of the things she says in this section is that some of the people that are doing these things don't realize it. They're unconscious of the harm that they're doing. And I guess that's better than just outright being in opposition and rebellion, but at the same time, we don't need to be unaware or ignorant. We have a lot of information at our disposal, so we will still be held accountable for the information that we could have known and yet didn't make an effort to know. She's quoting here from Matthew chapter 7, where she quotes Christ, "Depart from me, all ye workers of iniquity." And she says that they'll be astonished to hear that, but that their supposedly Christian lives were a fraud. They were a deception. I'd like to quote Matthew 7, verses 21 to 23. Here's what it says. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Just want to pause for a second to let that sink in. I mean, that's really a powerful statement by Jesus. I'll read it again. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. So, not everyone who professes that Jesus is Lord will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Now, how are we to know what the will of the Father in heaven is? Let's keep reading. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons and do many powerful deeds? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you lawbreakers. This is such an incredible statement by Jesus. Throughout much of Christianity, it is promoted that it isn't necessary to obey God's law, that we are saved in our sin because Jesus died so that we wouldn't be held accountable for our sin. I'm not going to go into all of the scriptures that touch on this. I'm just going to deal with this one here that's being referenced in the Testimonies, just mainly for sake of time. Maybe we'll do another video in the future about this in more detail. But here is a quotation of something that Jesus said, and obviously it's not word for word. Again, Jesus wasn't speaking in English. He was speaking either Aramaic or Hebrew. But this is the gist of what he said. The message is clear. Not everyone who calls him Lord, not everyone who prophesied in his name, who cast out demons and did many wonderful works, not many of those will be saved. Only, now this is according to Jesus, only those who do the will of his Father in heaven. And then, to know what that means, he says, when they say, hey, haven't we done all these things? He tells them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you lawbreakers. So I think that's very important for all of us to keep in mind, that we cannot be saved in sin, but only those who have allowed God to give us victory over sin in the life will be granted entrance into the kingdom of heaven. That's what Jesus says. So I'm going to continue on with the rest of the testimony. Some express their views that the testimony of Sister White cannot be reliable. This is all that many unconsecrated ones want. The testimonies of reproof have checked their vanity and pride. But if they dared, they would go to almost any length in fashion and pride. God will give all such an opportunity to prove themselves and to develop their true characters. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 313. I saw that the reason why visions had not been more frequent of late is that they have not been appreciated by the church. The church have nearly lost their spirituality and faith, and the reproofs and warnings have had but little effect upon them. Many of those who have professed faith in them have not heeded them. It was Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 119. Now, that was written in 1855. That's only 11 years after the formation of the Advent people after they understood what really took place on Day of Atonement in 1844. And already the visions were decreasing. They weren't nearly as frequent, and it was because they weren't appreciated. They weren't being taken seriously. I mean, why would God continue to send instruction in such a manner, such a remarkable manner, if it wasn't doing them any good, and if it wasn't doing us any good? And she says here that many of those who have professed faith in the testimonies and in the visions have not heeded them. Now, this is where we should pause and we should ask ourselves, have I heeded them? You know, when I read these testimonies, I should be reading them as if they were written to me, as should all of us. And I have to ask myself, have I heeded the testimonies? If you lose confidence in the testimonies, you will drift away from Bible truth. I have been fearful that many would take a questioning, doubting position, and in my distress for your souls, I would warn you. How many will heed the warning? As you now hold the testimonies, should one be given crossing your track, correcting your errors, would you feel at perfect liberty to accept or reject any part or the whole? That which you will be least inclined to receive is the very part most needed. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 98. So again, speaking to us who profess belief in the testimonies, what's our attitude toward them today? Do we feel at liberty to pick and choose what part we want to accept, or even we're just going to reject the whole thing? When we do that, you know, she's telling us here that the parts that we would end up rejecting are the very parts that we need the most. So one thing we could do is, if we, on self-examining here now, if we find that, yeah, we have done that in the past, or even that we're doing it now, whatever. But if we find that we've done that, then we still have an opportunity to say, okay, what part did I ignore? And then we can recognize, okay, that's what I need the most. And then we can remedy that. It's not too late. My brethren, beware of the evil heart of unbelief. The Word of God is plain and close in its restrictions. It interferes with your selfish indulgence. Therefore, you do not obey it. The testimonies of His Spirit call your attention to the Scriptures, point out your defects of character, and rebuke your sins. Therefore, you do not heed them. And to justify your carnal, ease-loving course, you begin to doubt whether the testimonies are from God. If you would obey their teachings, you would be assured of their divine origin. Remember, your unbelief does not affect their truthfulness. If they are from God, they will stand. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 234. I have been shown that unbelief in the testimonies of warning, encouragement, and reproof is shutting away the light from God's people. Unbelief is closing their eyes so that they are ignorant of their true condition. They think the testimony of the Spirit of God in reproof is uncalled for, or that it does not mean them. Such are in the greatest need of the grace of God and spiritual discernment, that they may discover their deficiency in spiritual knowledge. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, pages 255, 253, and 254. Now, if unbelief in the testimonies is shutting away light from God's people, man, we need to make it a point to test for ourselves and know whether they are from God. And if we find that they are from God, let us not disbelieve them. Let us believe them so that we will not have the light shut away from us. Many who have backslidden from the truth assign as a reason for their course that they do not have faith in the testimonies. The question now is, will they yield their idol which God condemns, or will they continue in their wrong course of indulgence and reject the light God has given them, reproving the very things in which they delight? The question to be settled with them is, shall I deny myself and receive as of God the testimonies which reprove my sins? Or shall I reject the testimonies because they reprove my sins? Nobody likes to have their sins pointed out. Most people don't. That is the biggest reason why people have a problem with the testimonies for the church, because they are very exacting. And, the Bible's really exacting too, but we tend to soften it over a bit. But when we compare what we find in the New Testament, the words of Jesus, different things, like we saw earlier, not everyone who says to Jesus, Lord, Lord, they're calling him Lord, they're recognizing, they're confessing that he's Lord, but not many will be granted entrance into heaven. Only those who do the will of his Father in heaven. That is very exacting. So these are things that, once we come to terms with the fact that, sin is a really bad thing, and not pretend that it isn't. God isn't in the business of pretending. God sees us the way we truly are. But there has been a way made for us to be freed from sin. And Jesus showed us that way. He came and lived and died to show us how awful sin really is. And by that, that alone, witnessing that, contemplating that, can change us if we let it. In many cases, the testimonies are fully received, the sin and indulgence broken off, and reformation at once commences in harmony with the light God has given. In other instances, sinful indulgences are cherished, the testimonies are rejected, and many excuses which are untrue are offered to others as the reason for refusing to receive them. The true reason is not given. It is a lack of moral courage, a will strengthened and controlled by the Spirit of God to renounce hurtful habits. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 32. Satan has ability to suggest doubts and to devise objections to the pointed testimony that God sends, and many think it a virtue, a mark of intelligence in them, to be unbelieving and to question and quibble. Those who desire to doubt will have plenty of room. God does not propose to remove all occasion for unbelief. He gives evidence, which must be carefully investigated with a humble mind and a teachable spirit, and all should decide from the weight of evidence. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 255. Such a great statement. We're almost done, but I just had to pause and go over this one a little bit more. Notice that, the points that she's bringing out here, obviously there's some people who think it's really a sign of intelligence. Oh, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Are you sure about this? And, question, quibble, and really doubt. And she's saying, hey, you know what? There's room to doubt. God doesn't propose to remove every occasion for doubt. What God does is He provides evidence. And what we are supposed to do is not to just blindly believe. God doesn't want ignorant obedience either. He wants intelligence. He wants us to obey because we love Him, because we love His law. And that's really the only way to truly obey anyway, is through love. But here, God has given us plenty of evidence. What we have to do is we have to make the effort to investigate the evidence. And we need to do so like a scientist. You know, when a scientist is doing an experiment, you have to be unbiased. You cannot be hoping and expecting and trying to find a certain outcome. Because if that's your mode of thinking while you're looking into things, your experiment is not going to be a true experiment. No, we need to be very open to receiving whatever the truth is. We can't have a preconceived idea in our mind of the way things are and then go to look and see if the evidence lines up with our idea. No, that's not the way it works. We have to be teachable, we have to be humble, and we have to just be willing to follow the truth no matter what it is. But we also have to make the effort to investigate the evidence. So the evidence is there, and we should decide not because, we should make our decision not because we like the outcome. We should make our decision not because it seems like, well, I prefer that over the other thing or anything like that. No, it shouldn't come down to our preference. It should come down to the weight of evidence. What is the truth? And that's it. So I just absolutely love this statement because it has so much. It points out our need to not quibble and doubt and be, of that mindset, but it also does not try to teach us that, hey, you're not to question at all. You're just supposed to accept what someone tells you is truth, and that's it. Otherwise, you don't really have faith. That's not faith. Faith has to be based on evidence. You believe in something because you've tested it, because you know that it's true. So, yeah, great statement. I just love it. So then here's the next one. God gives sufficient evidence for the candid mind to believe. But he who turns from the weight of evidence because there are a few things which he cannot make plain to his finite understanding will be left in the cold, chilling atmosphere of unbelief and questioning doubts, and will make shipwreck of faith. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, pages 232 and 233. So man, let's just determine to examine the evidence, to learn what is true, and then not to doubt the truth. Once we have learned what the truth is, let's not doubt. Let's not quibble and question. Let us move forward in faith, knowing that the truth will set us free. Love you all. Have a wonderful evening. Shalom, and we'll see you next time.